thank you for inviting me to participate in this Zoom series of talks on pre-Safavid Shi art. And may I pay tribute at the beginning to the previous speakers in this series, from whom I've learned a huge amount. Indeed, such was the information pouring forth from the different speakers that I had great difficulty keeping up with my pen and paper as I tried to note the pearls that fell from their lips. I also have recently, through the good offices of Robert Hillenbrand, come across Muhammad Mashhadi Nushabadi and Muhammad Reza Ghiasyan's book, Mavad Farhangiya Shi'i, to which I must also pay tribute. Their book focuses on the Shi arts associated with Kashan, tile work, woodwork, textiles, steelwork, and stone carvings from the Il-Khanid to the Qajar period, and is a rich mine of information about Shi objects associated with Kashan. But that book also left me in a quandary. Can any of you, at the end of this talk, please suggest how I can send a copy of the book Brian Gilmore and I wrote on Persian steel, and my own book on the art and architecture of Twelver Shi'ism, to these esteemed colleagues in Kashan? If you can help with some information on that front, please let me know. When I was asked to give a talk in this series, I had no idea what I would talk about. So I chose a very general title, Avenues or Cul-de-sacs. This was designed to give me maximum room for maneuver. Well, some months later, I have two avenues that I now want to explore, and I'll leave you to decide whether they lead somewhere or are, after all, cul-de-sacs. So first, an avenue towards Shi'is and Sunnis in 11th century Aleppo. As has been mentioned a number of times in this lecture series, Shi'is and Sunnis cannot always be delineated neatly, and it was perfectly possible for many Sunnis, as well as Shi'is, to venerate the Prophet's family and his descendants, the Alids, or descendants of Ali. This was a feature encouraged by the widely recognized scholarly role in the transmission of the prophetic hadith of two of the Imams, the fifth Imam, Muhammad al-Baqir, who died in 733, and the sixth Imam, Ja'far as-Sadiq, who died in 765, a role accepted by Sunni ulama. So as a result, out of affection for the family of the Prophet, pious Sunnis might visit the burial sites or shrines of the Imams, and indeed might act as patrons of such institutions while not holding to Shi'i religious doctrine. This aspect of the Imami shrines has been discussed by a number of authors. May Farhat, for example, drew attention to a number of medieval Sunni pilgrims and patrons of the shrine of the eighth Imam in Mashhad. Thus, one particular group of devotees were Khorasani Hadith scholars, Orthodox Muslims who respected the role of the Imam Reza in the transmission of Hadiths of the Prophet. Another particular patron was Mahmud of Ghazni, a staunch Sunni who nevertheless seems to have seen Ali as a particular source of moral authority. He's said to have seen Ali in a dream and interpreted Ali's question, "How long will this go on?" to refer to the shrine at Mashhad, which had been destroyed by his father in 997. As a result, Mahmud rebuilt the shrine. Sufis, too, with often broader religious beliefs, were regular visitors to the shrine, and such eminent Sunni Seljuks as Malik Shah and his vizier Nizam al-Mulk also prayed at the shrine, and other Sunni patrons had particular religious or political agendas into which they conveniently fitted their patronage of the Imami shrines. Further west, Stephanie Mulder has documented in great detail the extent of Sunni-Shi collaboration in the patronage of Alid shrines in Greater Syria. Her book argues that throughout Islamic history, but particularly in the period of the 11th to 13th centuries, the shrines of the Alids in Syria repeatedly became objects of patronage by both Sunni and Shi'i elites, and that this process created a newly unifying and distinctly Islamic sacred landscape. In her study, she found that shrines that had been assumed to be primarily Shi'i spaces turned out to have been founded or later configured by Sunni elite figures to be shared, pan-Islamic, and inclusive. And Teresa Bernheimer has discussed the extent of Sunni-Shi collaboration outside Greater Syria. Such collaboration offers a striking contrast to the antagonism so often felt between the two sects at other times. Ibn al-Athir's account of the sectarian violence in Baghdad in the 11th century makes it clear that it's centered on the call to prayer or on inscriptions on religious buildings. Some of the detail is confusing, but we know that in 443, that's 1051-2, there was an issue over some towers built by the men of Karkh, who were Shis, which had inscribed in gold on them, Muhammad and Ali are the best of men. The Rais al-Ru'asa was pro-Hanbali, so the Shis were forced to remove the phrase, are the best of men, after the names of Muhammad and Ali, and instead put up the phrase, on them both be peace. The Sunnis, however, said that they would only be satisfied if the bricks on which Muhammad and Ali had been written were pulled out, and if come to the best of works was not used in the call to prayer. However, that was more than the Shis could accept. The subsequent fighting led to the destruction of the Shi shrine of the Straw Gate and the tombs of the 7th Imam, Musa al-Kazim, and the 9th Imam, Muhammad al-Jawad, which it contained. Almost contemporary was a conflict noted in passing by Mulda. In 1069, the Shi'i Mirdasid prince and ruler of Aleppo, Mahmud ibn Nasr, sensing that the political winds were blowing in favor of Sunnism, ordered that the khutbah should no longer honor the Fatimid Caliph, but instead name the Abbasid Caliph and the Seljuk Emir. The response from the attendees of the Friday prayer was telling. They snatched up their prayer mats and said, "These are the mats of Ali ibn Abi Talib. Let Abu Bakr bring mats for the people to pray upon." This points to different inscribed mats, some with inscriptions which included the Shi Shahada, or at least the name of Ali ibn Abi Talib on them, and others which indicated Sunnism, presumably through inscriptions giving the names of the 4 Orthodox caliphs. Such inscriptions were evidently the prime mechanisms for identifying sectarian differences. Tiraz, yes, inscribed textiles are of course common in the form of tiraz fragments, of which there are many in museums and private collections around the world. And here's an early 10th century example in the As-Sabah collection in Kuwait. It has a long inscription glorifying the unnamed caliph of the day. However, we're concerned about floor coverings rather than clothing. So a brief excursion on the role of inscribed floor coverings, including prayer rugs in the pre-Safavid period, would be useful. That they existed in Safavid times, we know. Here's an example in a private collection, which is clearly Shi'i, being inscribed with the names of Muhammad and Ali in square Kufic on the left of this slide. In the pre-Safavid period, particularly under the Il-Khanids, carpets with Kufesque borders were evidently widespread. Here are 3 fragmentary pieces found in the Alauddin Jami in Konya and now in the Turkish and Islamic Museum in Istanbul. And each of them, as you can see, has a Kufesque border here on the left, in the center, and all the way around the piece on the right. And here are 2 more examples with Kufesque borders. These were found in the mosque in Divrik in Turkey. And a further example from the Alauddin Jami here on the slide. So that shows the range of extant pieces in Turkey. Others, in the case of animal carpets, are in private collections. So carpets with kufesque borders look to have been almost the norm in the 14th century. The great Mongol Shahnameh, recently pieced together in a major publication by Robert Hillenbrand, shows many more examples. And here are three, which I just took out of his book, all with kufesque borders. Some of the illustrations in the great Mongol Shahnameh, as here, suggest that the origin of the kufesque border was the word el-mulk, sovereignty, taken from the phrase el-mulk lillah, sovereignty belongs to God. More relevant, however, to prayer mats are a type of flat weaves, namely zilus. The existence of inscribed pre-Safavid zilus suggests that inscribed flat weaves were also relatively common. The most discussed has been the zilu in the Hermitage Museum, St. Petersburg, which is shown here, which bears the name of the weaver Master Ali Noshabadi and a date which Mohammad Reza Ghiasian and Muhammad Mashhadi Noshabadi have recently read as 808, that is 1406. Their extremely interesting and important article in Iranian Carpet Studies, Volume 6, details the evidence for zilus and zilu weaving, and in particular weaving in the Kashan area and in Nushabad from earliest times onwards. But their research has also made clear that zilus were being produced over a much wider area. Thus, according to the late 10th century Hudud al-Alam and to El-Istakhri and Ibn Hawqal, zilus called Jahrami were produced in a city by that name in Fars. They were also produced in Sistan in the 11th century, according to Nasir-e-Khusro. Tun in Kohistan was a particularly active center of production too. But outside Iran, they were also produced in a number of centers in Anatolia, Dabil, Bitlis, Ahlat, Erzurum, and so on, as well as Nakhchivan and Azerbaijan. Fragments of cloth, which technically may be related to zilus, with designs which suggest a Sasanian background, have also been excavated at Fustat and the Red Sea port of Qusair al-Qadim. Moreover, as Mohammad Reza Ghiasian and Muhammad Mashhadi Noshabadi point out, there's also evidence for zilus in the 14th century. Not only does Mustalfi, who died in 1340, attribute zilu production to a city in Armenia, but the use of zilus in mosques is also mentioned by Rashid ad-Din, who died in 1318, in the Waqfiyya of Rabbi Rashidi. There he outlines the duties of mosque caretakers as including protection of zilus, carpets, and prayer mats. And in his section on Sufi lodges, he assigns the spreading of zilus to the attendants. Other zilus have survived. Here, for example, is a zilu in a private collection, which may well be Il-Khanid, though where it was made, we have no idea. I'm very grateful to Michael Francis for its details and images. Some of its decoration recalls brickwork and tilework decoration of the Seljuk and Il-Khanid periods, and amongst these patterns, it would be perfectly possible to read the name of Ali in square Kufic, though it's impossible to say whether that is meant or not. And by that is where I think it would be perfectly possible to read the name of Ali in the square Kufic that goes around that border. So carpets with kufesque borders or flat weave floor coverings, i.e. zilus, with inscriptions, were evidently widespread by the 14th century and point to an earlier tradition of inscribed floor coverings, or at least floor coverings with inscribed borders. So what about prayer mats? Did such mats exist? The final proof comes from the Al-Sabah collection in Kuwait, published in part by Marilyn Jenkins in 1983, and it includes a mat fragment woven apparently from straw and undyed hemp, which she ascribes to Syria in the first half of the 10th century AD. It's 40.3 centimeters wide and is inscribed with a series of good wishes or perhaps prayers for the well-being of the owner. It is the only evidence of inscribed mats that has so far come to light for this period and is incredibly important for that reason. Hence, concluding this first part of my talk, it seems to me that there's enough evidence in pre-Safavid carpets with kufesque borders to support the likelihood of inscribed carpets, and more importantly, enough evidence for inscribed flat weaves, zilus, going back into earlier centuries in the central Islamic lands. These pieces, plus the al-Sabah mat, point to inscribed prayer mats in the 10th century, supporting the recorded reaction of the Shi'i prayers to the changing of the khutbah by the Mirdasid prince Mahmud ibn Nasr. In a broader context, this emphasizes the importance of inscriptions in providing visual definition of and for belief in early Islam. Now, to my second avenue or cul-de-sac. It may well be that inscriptions and the call to prayer were the two key features which identified a building as being Shi'i. But some objects may also have had the same function, in particular the lamp within a niche. In a discussion of the Mashhad al-Muhassin in Aleppo, Mulder writes as follows: although Khoury, in an article in Muqarnas 9, claims that the image of a lamp within a niche was neutral from the perspective of sectarian associations, a survey of the examples she provides in her article suggests otherwise. Mulder then points out that of the 16 shrines Khoury presents that contain this image, 10 are spaces devoted to the Alids or to members of the Ahl al-Bayt, in which case, Mulder maintains, it is reasonable to propose that the image held special significance for Shi'i worshippers, particularly considering that Ali and the 12 imams are often described as being the bearers of divine light, and that the imamate was passed from one imam to the next via the transmission of such light. Hussein, she continues, is often described as shining with divine light or as himself being a light, and the imagery of light, the light of God inhabiting the bodies of holy Alid figures is common in Shi'i religious literature. The image of a lamp within a niche and its association with Surat al-Nur then could have been meant to function as a polyvalent sign that simultaneously marked the space as a locus of general holiness and commemoration, made general reference to the light of God for Sunnis via the Surat al-Nur, and for Shi'is, reminded the viewer that al-Muhassin, as an Alid descendant, was designated as both the recipient and the point of emanation of such holy light. The idea of a lamp as a polyvalent sign leads us further into Fatimid Ayyubid Mamluk and Il-Khanid art, and I want to pursue that avenue for the rest of the talk. The ideas may not be new, for I published an article around this topic in the Journal of the David Collection in 2003. However, as the Il-Khanids are generally seen from an Iranian perspective, it may be worth rediscovering how their use of specific Fatimid-derived motifs and designs reflect the Fatimid Shi'i past of the Near East, a very different source from the specifically Iranian or the Far Eastern traditions normally associated with them. In my earlier article, I was able to show that the Fatimids used circular inscriptions to promote their Shi'i beliefs, that they used radiating designs around inscriptions to illustrate the divine nas of the Shi'i imams, that they used six-pointed and other stellar forms to further emphasize that nas, and that we can follow the use of these of other motifs into the Mamluk period, where we find them both adopted and adapted to promote the power and orthodoxy of the Mamluk dynasty before they move on to impact Il-Khanid visual culture. So first, let's look at the Facade of Al-Akmar. Incidentally, this image is of the rebuilt right-hand side of the Facade of Al-Akmar, and I'm aware of that, but I used it rather than the original one on the left because it shows up better in photographs. But if we look at the facade of Al-Akbar, founded in 1125, and in particular the inscription on the beveled corner of the facade at the far left over here, which is shown in detail on the right, we find in three little niches, Surah 16, verse 1 to 8. In the top niche is the first part of it, verily God is with. In the bottom right niche is the second part of it, those who are God-fearing. In the bottom left niche is the third part of it, and those who are doers of good. So in full it reads, verily God is with those who are God-fearing and those who are doers of good. But the roundels on each side of the top niche mean that the message can equally be read, God is with Muhammad and Ali. Another inscription which should be noticed is in the center of the hood of the flat arch on the left-hand side of the facade, where we find the name of Ali surrounded by 5 interlinked Muhammads. It's got Wa Ali in the middle. Sorry, this is slightly blurred. It's taken from a Creswell photograph, which wasn't absolutely spot on. Hence, a strongly Ismaili message is being projected from the inscriptions on this building. Now, the key circular inscription on this building is that in the original midpoint, here on the left there, of the exterior of the Mosque of Al-Akbar over the doorway. In the center of the inscription are the names of Muhammad and Ali, Muhammad wa Ali, and around them a circular inscription with Surah 33, verse 33, O people of the house, Ahl-Bayt, God only desires to put away from you abomination and with cleansing to cleanse you. This verse not only mentions the Ahl-Bayt or family of the Prophet, but also brings to mind 2 specifically Shi'i historical moments. The first was when the Prophet identified the so-called people of the cloak, Ahl al-Kasa. According to a hadith, Muhammad went out one morning wearing a cloak, under which he took first Fatima, then Ali, and then Hassan and Hussein. He hugged them and quoted this verse, thereby, according to Shi'i belief, denoting those through whom the true succession was to be established, the so-called people of the cloak. This verse was used secondly by the angel Gabriel when Muhammad's body was being prepared for burial at the very moment Abu Bakr was being appointed the first caliph. Shi'is believe that Ali should have been appointed. Another aspect of the use of inscriptions by the Fatimids relates to their coinage and the so-called bullseye or concentric circle design. The first Fatimid capital, Al-Mansuriya, outside Kairouan, founded in 948, was circular, with the palace of its founder, Al-Mansur, in the center. The next Fatimid ruler, El-Muiz, who ruled from 953 to 975, produced a novel type of concentric circle coin design with an aggressively Ismaili message in the center, which he then replaced by a central raised dot, hence the bullseye name given to these issues. Alternatively, essential Ismaili claims often later replaced the dot. For example, on the coinage of Al-Hafiz in the early 12th century, the center of the obverse contained the Caliph Imam's name and title, while on others, in addition, the center of the reverse bore the words, Muhammad is the prophet of God and Ali is Wali, friend of God. The concentric circles remain throughout the Fatimid period. The use of circles, concentric circles, and bullseyes were, it seems, fundamental to Ismaili thought, and this type of design referred back to the use of concentric circles in Ismaili texts to provide analogies for Ismaili belief, and hence memory devices. Thus, the dot in the center of a circle provided, amongst other things, an analogy for the Ismaili saying that belief embodies Islam, but Islam does not embody belief. In other words, a believer, that is an Ismaili, is a Muslim, but a Muslim is not necessarily a believer, that is an Ismaili. A recurring theme of Ismaili doctrine is the Nas, the divine light transmitted to the successive Imams who are descended from Ali. On the Mosque of Al-Akbar, whose facade was originally designed to mirror the three mihrabs woven into the kiswa of the Kaaba. The niche on the top left, the facade, and now a copied niche on the top right, is decorated with a mosque lamp hanging in an arch. On its spandrels are two roundels, one bearing the name Muhammad and the other the words "and Ali." Below the lamp is an open grille which radiates from a central six-pointed star. This combination of images clearly refers the viewer to Surah 24, verse 35. God is the light of the heavens and the earth. The likeness of his light is as a niche wherein is a lamp, the lamp in a glass, the glass, as it were, a glittering star. It's noteworthy, however, that early Sunni and Shi'i Quranic exegesis did not permit the equation of the lamp with the light of God, but rather with the light of the prophet. That this is the interpretation intended here is supported by the fact that the light is coupled not with God's name, but with the names of Muhammad and Ali, i.e., their joint prophetic light. It is also an evocation of a hadith or tradition of the prophet, popular with Shi'is, which goes as follows: the stars are a pledge to the world that it will not be drowned, and my family are a pledge to the community that it will not go astray. This emphasis on light pervades Ismailism. Thus, Rashid ad-Din ibn Shahrashub, a Shi'i author who died in 1192, includes in his book on the virtues of the family of Abu Talib the following epithets for al-Hussein. Quote, "The lamp of those who trust in God, the lamp of the lofty family ties, the shining full moon, light of the Fatimid family, and a part of the light." And the same author quotes a poem composed by Hussein himself in which he says, "My father is a sun, my mother a moon, and I am the star, the son of the two moons. My grandfather was the lamp of guidance." The words "ana qamar," I am a moon, are actually used as the decorative repeat motif on a Fatimid textile fragment in the Ashmolean Museum's Newbury collection, and must thus indicate Fatima, al-Hussein's mother, a fascinating confirmation of the relevance of such metaphors for the Fatimids. Hence, the two large keel arches which survive on the facade of the Mosque of Al-Akmar, with their central roundels containing the names of Muhammad and Ali, radiate the divine light. The other arches, niches, and roundels which decorate the facade take up the theme. These include a six-petaled rosette at the center of the niche, to the left, the point of the arch above the main entrance. It's there, but it's, sorry, I couldn't get a close-up of that. The same message was repeated by the conch-shaped hoods of the mihrabs in many of the 12th century Fatimid mausolea of Cairo. Kulthum, the Mashhad of Sayyida Ruqayya, the mausoleum of Muhammad al-Hassawati, and the mausoleum of Yahya al-Shabih. Also noteworthy is the fact that the roundel in the left-hand arch of the facade of Al-Akbar and at the focal point of the main mihrab, in here the mihrab of Sayyida Ruqayya, contains the name of Ali, surrounded 6 times by the name of Muhammad, which provides the logical source for the 6-pointed star design in the same position on the portico mihrabs. So I'm sorry, this is not a great photograph, but in the center is Wa Ali and then Muhammad 6 times around it. Now let's move on in time to the Mamluk period in the 13th, 14th century in the Fertile Crescent. And what do we find? Well, we find 2 things: circular inscriptions which run in the opposite direction to the Fatimid ones, which nevertheless demonstrate the idea of sun and light. And we find 6-pointed star designs which have every appearance of demonstrating the ruler as a source of light for his subjects. Let's start with the 6-pointed star. An obvious example is the interlaced rectilinear 6-pointed star on the neck of this 14th century candlestick in the name of Muhammad ibn Sadr ad-Din Yusuf ibn Salah ad-Din, which was in the Nohad Asad collection now in Doha. The relationship of this motif to the parallel Fatimid motifs and its equation at some level with the concept of light is indicated by the 6 almond-shaped drops in the external interstices of the star. And you should be able to just see them around the 6-pointed star there. These must surely be seen as rays of light emanating from the light source. This in its turn leads to a new appreciation of the symbolic nature of the decoration of this particular candlestick and others of similar origin. In the Nurd Aside collection catalogue, I based my symbolic interpretation of 6-petaled rosettes on the fact that, like more obvious sun symbols, they were decorated with gold rather than silver inlay. That remains true, but more important, we can now see is the fact that they are descendants of the Fatimid tradition and have brought the idea of light with them from that background. The idea of light remains intact, but we can assume a change in religious ideology. This candlestick demonstrates a further dependency on the Fatimid tradition in its use of strapwork interlace between the rosettes on its body, shoulder, which you can't unfortunately see, and on the candle holder. Strapwork regularly appears in Fatimid textiles, and in 1125 we find it in use on the semicircular back of the mihrab niche of the mausoleum of Kulthum in Cairo. Here it forms interlaced crosses and 8-pointed stars as a background for the roundels containing the names of Ali and Muhammad, which must again symbolically direct the divine light on the worshippers. On the Nurd side candlestick, it has lost its personal message since none of the star symbols bear the names of Muhammad or Ali, nor even of God, but the overwhelming effect of the stars in their cosmic setting and of the light which they emit is indisputable, so the general image and impact remain. We could perhaps claim the same interpretation for the inside of the dome of the Karatai Madrasa in Konya, dating from 1251. Another motif worth noting at this point is the plant form in the form of a diamond at the bottom of this slide, which occurs on the facade of the Mosque of Al-Akmar just below the niche with a lamp, which we've already discussed. Caroline Williams relates it to a tradition of the Prophet in which he is recorded as saying, Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein are my 2 sweet-smelling herbs in the world. This offers a fascinating explanation of its presence in such a conspicuous place, particularly if the mosque originally had a symmetrical facade with the left wing repeated on the right-hand side of the entrance. This would have given 2 such plants, one for Al-Hassan and one for Al-Hussein. The continuing popularity of this motif can be seen in subsequent metalwork, where both the plant form and its diamond-shaped cartouche are multiplied to cover much larger areas of design. Here's an example, the 14th century pen case in the Nurd Aside collection, now in Doha, and the plant form in a diamond-shaped cartouche goes all the way around the edge of the pen box and the edge of its flat top. It must also be the source of the motifs in diamond-shaped lozenges on the Il-Khanid window grille ball joint from Al-Jaitu's reign in the Allan collection. And here's the motif I'm talking about, which is on the shoulder of this window grille ball joint. And it also occurs all the way around the edge of the Il-Khanid inlaid dish, also in the Allan collection. In this case, the assumption must be that this motif spread eastwards from Egypt and Syria into the Il-Khanid domains. Another motif which stands out in the Egyptian and Syrian context of Mamluk metalwork is the epigraphic sun disk, which I've discussed at some length in the Nurd Aside catalogue. The most striking example is that on the magnificent incense burner in the Nurd Aside collection, but it's relatively common metalwork of the period. Hitherto, there seemed to be no precedent for such a design, although there was an obvious visual connection with the sun and light. Now it seems we can trace its origin in Fatimid religious symbols. Incidentally, it is surely no coincidence that Al-Malik Nasser's sun disk on his magnificent incense burner is set in a cusped roundel, for all the Fatimid examples have cusped arches. This too is part of the Fatimid symbolism associated with light, and could therefore be conveniently used alongside a royal inscription to indicate the Sultan of the Orthodox as the light of his subjects. Circular Arabic inscriptions occur as early as the 9th century. Arabic being read from right to left, such inscriptions almost always go anti-clockwise, with the main elements of the letters on the inside of the circle and the uprights of the letters radiating outwards. For simplicity's sake, we may call this type of inscription read on the inside. Such inscriptions read on the inside occur, for example, on the 4 bronze door plates in the name of the Habarid Amir, Abdullah ibn Umar, 883 to 913, which were found on Mansoura in southern Pakistan. The inscriptions on the Nohada side incense burner, on the other hand, are read clockwise. In other words, read on the outside. Various questions immediately arise. For example, is there a relationship between the two types of circular inscription? If so, what is it? And when did the direction of the inscription change? From the period of the Mamluk Sultan Baybars, around about 1260, comes what is probably the earliest example of an Egyptian or Syrian inscription read completely on the outside. This example is on an embroidery in the Ashmolean Museum, where the word El-Ez, glory, forms the surround for Baybar's blaze and a walking lion. And next, chronologically, come the royal inscriptions which decorate the ceiling of the mausoleum of Sultan Kalaun, 1285, and from the very end of the century, the inscription in the dome of the mausoleum of Zainuddin Yusuf, 1298. A halfway house could be suggested by an inscription on the facade of the Mosque of Baybars dating from sometime between 1266 and 1269. On the mosque's southwestern entrance are 2 large circular medallions carved in relief bearing Surah 24:36, a verse which follows the light verse already mentioned. It reads, "This lamp is found in houses which Allah hath allowed to be exalted, and that his name shall be remembered therein. Therein do offer praise to him at morn and evening." Presumably there was somewhere on this facade or inside the mosque the light verse itself in a similar medallion, so that the 2 medallions had an appropriate context. Although the top part reads from the inside, the lower part has been reversed so that it reads from the outside. There are a number of possible reasons for this, the most obvious being a practical one. It's very difficult to read the bottom part of a circular inscription of this type without standing on your head. Hence, there may have been a move to make these inscriptions more legible by turning the lower part round so it's easier to read. This was a common device when dealing with rectangular windows or similar decorated areas, and one can find plenty of examples of that. It could then have been that through such practical changes to circular inscriptions, the advantages of the clockwise inscription became apparent, namely that since it's easier to pack in the uprights than the basic letter forms in Arabic, inscriptions read on the outside can be much longer than inscriptions read on the inside and thus contain far more information. Artists or patrons may also have discovered that inscriptions read on the outside are much more convincing as symbols of the sun and therefore of light than those read on the inside, since the uprights are packed more closely just where they need to be, nearest the center. Leaving that problem aside for a moment, it's clear that the circular inscription read on the outside, having been established in architectural settings, then began to be regularly used on inlaid metalwork. It occurs on 4 magnificent pieces dating from the reign of Nasser Muhammad, Quran box in Berlin, a kursi in Cairo, a Quran box in Cairo, and the incense burner here shown. Following the death of Nasser Muhammad, it's found on a splendid rosewater sprinkler of Nasser Hassan on the right, and here's a close-up of the inscription of the incense burner on the left. But now, let's turn return to the changeover from red on the inside to red on the outside. Here a very fascinating parallel presents itself in the coinage of early 14th century Iran. The Il-Khanid Sultan Ul-Jaytu, who ruled from 1304 to 1316, inherited a coinage designed under his predecessor Ghazan Khan. However, following his conversion to Shiism, Ul-Jaytu changed the design. The example here has a circular obverse which contains, this is the piece on the left, which contains an expanded profession of Shi faith with the inclusion of the phrase Ali Wali Allah, Ali is the friend of God, and the blessings of the 12 Imams around the margin, and we should note they are read on the inside. On the reverse, the Sultan's name and titles fill the hex foil, and the margin contains the mint, the date, and a traditional Quranic phrase. But when we come to Abu Sa'id's reign, 1317-1335, and the return to orthodoxy, we find on particular types of his coinage that the names of the 4 orthodox caliphs are written to be read on the outside, while other marginal inscriptions on these issues are read on the inside. In other words, there may have been a deliberate policy of changing the direction of circular inscriptions away from the Shiite usage in order to make the return to Sunnism visible symbolically as well as in the actual names used, and then that being reversed to the Shiite usage by Ul-Jaytu. There's a general belief that the Il-Khanids influenced the Mamluks culturally and not the other way around. However, the motifs and designs we've been reviewing suggest otherwise. And it looks as though circular inscriptions, having been inherited from the Fatimids by the Mamluks, were deliberately reversed by them to prove their orthodoxy, and that Ul-Jaytu, once converted to Shiism, deliberately reverted to the Fatimid style, using inscriptions not only for their content, the 12 Imams, but as a visual symbol of his religious beliefs. From our study of Fatimid motifs, or of their symbolism, of their transmission to succeeding cultures, various things have now become clear. First, there were not only inscriptions projecting Shi beliefs on buildings and prayer mats, as we know from literary texts, there were also motifs which seem to have had religious significance. The mosque lamp, various symbols of light, and the plant in a diamond, for example. Some of these Fatimid motifs were apparently taken and reused on metalwork by the Ayyubids, Seljuks, Mamluks, and even Il-Khanids. More important, there were different levels of understanding of these motifs and different ways of reusing them. Some were transmitted, but the extent to which their Ismaili symbolism was appreciated is uncertain. Others clearly continued in a general way the theme of light, but lost the specificity of the Ismaili doctrine of Nas, the transmission of divine light through Muhammad and Ali. Others appear to have been consciously changed by the succeeding cultures to mold them to orthodoxy, which replaced Ismailism. In the case of the circular inscription, by reversing it, in order to reverse visually the doctrines of the previous heterodox dynasty. That indicates that the Mamluks understood enough of the symbolism of Fatimid circular inscriptions to want to, or need to, deliberately change that symbol. And that in turn suggests that the ensuing dynasties were very aware of the message contained in Fatimid decoration. We know that the Fatimid treasury was looted and that much of its contents would have been in circulation for many years to come, providing a source of motif and design for Ayyubid Mamluk craftsmen. However, the impact of Fatimid iconography on the Mamluks and through them on the Il-Khanids, which I hope I've demonstrated in this talk, suggests that Fatimid culture, with its strong Ismaili message, had a much greater impact on succeeding cultures than previously thought. In conclusion, such a movement of ideas and redistribution of motifs makes it all the more likely, I think, that the lustre tradition was part of that process as postulated by other art historians. In other words, on the basis of this, albeit indirect evidence, it seems likely that the luster tradition was indeed transferred from Egypt to Iran through Ismailis or Shis. These artisans carried the technology with them and settled in a city with pronounced pro-Shi'i sympathies, Kashan. Thank you very much.